all, and we are very pleased to have you for this
Namaskar.
webinar. And uh, my colleague Shubham from the Narrative, and we from the Asia-Eurasia Human Rights Forum welcome you. So, Shubham, can you please take ahead the proceedings? Thank you. Shubham? Shubham, are you live? Can you please take ahead the proceedings? Yeah.
Namaskar. Welcome to the narrative. At present era, Maoism is a threat to the whole world, including India. It is engaged in destabilizing India internally for the last 5 decades. To understand all aspects of Maoism, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, but you are breaking, Shubhamji.
Now everything okay?
Yeah, now it's okay.
At present era, Maoism is a threat to the whole world, including India. It is engaged in destabilizing India internally for the last 5 decades. To understand all aspects of Maoism, we have organized this special international webinar in association with Asian Eurasian Human Rights Forum on the platform of The Narrative. The Narrative is an independent media group with the objective of nation first, trying to create an India-centric discourse of all such topics. If you have any query related to the topic, then you can ask in the comment box of live video. Shri Yashodhanji is present among us as a moderator in today's program. Yashodhanji participates in voluntary capacity in the field of children's rights. He also academic interest in human rights in the digital age. I request Yashodhanji to make a brief comment on today's topic and introduce Asian Eurasian Human Rights Forum and our speaker for today's webinar. Yashodhanji.
So, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. And we are very pleased to have you for today's webinar. So, Asian Eurasian Human Rights Forum was founded in 1998 to espouse the principles of universal human rights at the United Nations Human Rights Commission. One of the objectives of the organization is to educate the global community about the acts of radical religious beliefs and its impact on the human rights. AEHRF, as it is abbreviated as an NGO, was registered in New Delhi, India, under Societies of Registration Act 1868 as a non-profit and charitable society. The purpose stated in the application of the registration was to project human rights and of internationally displaced people. AEHRF applied for its UN ECOSOC status, and in 2014, it got the ECOSOC status. AEHRF made various interventions in United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva and spoke about various human rights issues from academic as well as practical perspective. The list of human rights issues tackled by AEHRF since 1998 is wide, and our president is Professor K.N. Pandita, who has joined today's panel, and also we have Alok G. Bansal, who is General Secretary of the organization, but I'll be introducing them formally during our panel session. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Anshuman Bahiraji, who is an academic from Bangalore, who has expertise in the topic today which we are dealing. And Anshuman Bahiraji has done his PhD in this particular topic of Maoism, and he has been continuously working in this particular domain. His research interests are in conflicts and radicalization. He has authored several journal papers on these issues of conflict resolution and peace research. He works in National Institute of Advanced Studies. So without taking much of your time, I will request Dr. Anshuman Bahiraji to please give his intervention. We are very pleased to have Anshumanji with us. He has written quite a lot of high impact journal papers as well as some a really good book, and we'll be talking about some of his research at the end of the presentation so that you can benefit from the literature which he has written. But before that, we will directly go to the topic, and I request Dr. Anshuman ji to talk about this particular issue at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasodhan ji. Before I start, I'll request you, can you see my screen visible? See
Yes. We can see you, but your slides are not yet presented.
Okay, let me then see this, how to sort of share screen. Can you see the slide now?
No, not yet. Now, yes. Now we can see your slides. Yes, absolutely. Now.
Yeah. Thank you, Yasodhan ji. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I would like to thank Asian Eurasian Human Rights Forum and the narrative, especially to you and Satish ji, for giving me an opportunity to speak on a topic that is very, very close to my research and to my kind of exploration, understanding the kind of threats not only to the state but to the human right and to the specific section of our society it actually poses. So as you have asked me to speak on Maoism in Asian perspective and the human rights situation, what I have done is I have taken three important, I call them Maoism or the militant communism, three important case studies. So I'll offer a kind of brief introduction to the kind of militant communism that we experienced in Bangladesh, then in Nepal. Then I'll straightforward come to the Indian experience, and my major focus will be on the Indian experience and drawing my kind of experiences from the Indian experience. So I'll offer a set of challenges that this particular militant communism or the Maoist movement actually pose to the human right issues to a specific section of our society. So this is the broad structure of my presentation. First, as I said, I'll offer an introduction to the Maoism in South Asia. Then the entire focus will be on the dynamics of Maoism in India. Then there will be a focus on the urban movement plan. Okay, this has actually created a lot of kind of interest among the people, where the state has unnecessarily and very unfairly been blamed of targeting the so-called civil society organizations, and who, without any remorse, without any kind of secret thing with this, they support in furthering the Maoist movement in the urban areas. Then I'll come to the issues and the stakeholders. Then at the last, I'll offer certain human rights situations. Let me bring you to the Maoist in Asia. I only confine to the South Asia here. If you see, one commonality of this Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, the rise of militant communism was around the same time. The time was around 1966-67. When you had the group of people in the Naxalbari area started an organized way of attacking the local feudals and the jamindars and all these people, what they call for their entitlement and the rights. But then that was the time which actually influenced the communists in the East Pakistan and the Nepal that time. They also took up arm in fighting what they call for justice. So then when I come to Bangladesh had a very interesting episode of militant communism. So they had this communist movement which was under the flagship of Bangladesh Communist Party, BCP. By 1968, you would see there was a breakaway faction that is called the Purba Banglar Communist Party, and this is a militant communist organization which believed or which actually got the ideological influence from the Naxalbari movement in India, and they wanted to fight the Islamists in Bangladesh. That is one. And the second, the feudalism, what they said, the feudals of Bangladesh. Okay, that is where you see that then the PPCP, the People Banglar Communist Party, actually got divided into two factions. One was the Janajuddha. Now that is what you saw, the People's War, what we say in India and Nepal, and then there was this red flag. This particular organization was basically active in Jessore and Khulna. What was the strategic importance of this was that both these districts were actually, sharing border with West Bengal, which had the kind of this influence of Naxalbari movement. So, but then, with the coming of the Khalida Zia to power in BNP, there was this organization. Many people believe that this Jagrata Muslim Janata Bangladesh, JMJB, was actually created to get rid of this PBCP. As the PBCP was actually attacking, militarily, both the IAMI League and the Khalida Zia's BNP, both these groups actually were actually, targeting this PBCP kind of, the militant organization to be completely wiped off from Bangladesh. So by 2009-10, you would see that the PBCP was completely, destroyed, and you don't find actually any of this militant communism active in Bangladesh. What was interesting to see that it more than the state action against a militant communism, you had a counter-Islamist militant group was actually created, JMJB, and later on the Jamaatul Mujahid in Bangladesh, that was taking on this PBCP kind of thing. And what you see interesting in Bangladesh was there was one extremist group, guided by the religious extremism or the religious kind of militancy, was actually targeting a communist or militant communist ideological faction, and that is where, with the support of these people like Jamaati Islami Bangladesh or the BNP, this PBCP, and later on by Sheikh Hasina's IAMI League, when it came to power in 2009, the PBCP was completely wiped out in Bangladesh. The Nepal experience offers very, very interesting. This was a movement that started, if you get into the history, it was in 1971, in a district called Jhapa. And popularly in Nepal, it's called the Jhapali movement. It was also influenced by the Indian Naxalbari movement, and that was the first kind of militant communism that we experienced. But the most organized and the most kind of dangerous way of fighting what they call for justice and all that was organized in 1996. I'll not take much time on that time, but then there was a 40-point demand, which was given to the elected government. Sher Bahadur Dubey was the prime minister at that time. Of course, there are three major demands of the Nepal Maoist. One, there was the end of monarchy. And then, as you all know, that Nepal has a wonderful history of political instability. They also, and most of these people, they feel that the root cause of this political instability was there was no legitimate or a credible kind of constitution written for Nepal. So the next demand by the Maoist was like, there has to be a constitutional committee, constituent assembly, which would write the constitution. And the third is to establish Nepal as a democratic secular republic kind of thing. Okay, so that is where you see the Nepal Communist Party, or the Unified Communist Party of Nepal. Many people claim that it was the factor which brought down the monarchy in Nepal. Okay, this can be contested. One can contest it. Okay, because the king or the monarchy was itself responsible in many ways, for its own kind of debacle. So by 1996, this movement actually started. It was one of the most bloodiest kind of militant communism that we have witnessed in South Asia. out of 75 districts, it had the control, except Kathmandu. It had virtually, it was not virtually, but it had complete control over all the districts, starting from the Tarai to the hills of Nepal. And by 2006, there was a peace agreement, what we call the 7-party alliance, and that is where the Nepal communists actually laid down their arms. And now what we see that, okay, the Maoist of Nepal was actually mainstreamed. Okay, they also came to power at this point of time. What you see that the Nepal Communist Party is virtually, it has withered away. If you put it in a Marxist term, to the extent that in a 275 strong member strong kind of parliament, they are reduced to 49 members. Okay, and there is a lot of factionalism among these people. Then we come to the Communist Party of India, the Maoist. Okay, this is one of the the focus of our discussion today, and it has a history of last for 58, 60 years. Starting from a lot of people go back to 1948. Okay, the Tibhaga movement in West Bengal, or the fighting against the in northern Telangana. But the first organized kind of thing you see in 1967 in the Naxalbari movement. We'll come to this thing, but if you see the commonality among these three militant communism or the Maoist movements in South Asia, they all derived, or they all kind of got influenced by something called what the Mao actually told how to run a particular movement to establish a new democratic order. Okay, so the new democracy is something very, very, very close to the Maoist thing, but they failed to sort of define what exactly it is. Okay, we'll come to that. Now, three magic weapons to run this particular movement: there has to be a party, there has to be an army, then there has to be a Revolutionary United Front. And this is something the Revolutionary United Front will come later. And the three pages. One is there has to organize or to set up the organization, and this organization has to follow a Leninist model of highly centralized and disciplined kind of party. Then you have once this organization is actually set up and it is run by a particular party, this will also have the guerrilla warfare. Then it will lead to the mobile warfare. If you see the Maoist in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, to some extent, the Nepal Maoist Party was able to march up to the mobile warfare stage. Okay, both Bangladesh and India. Okay, India is yet to get into the mobile warfare phase, and given the strength of Indian state, it is highly, highly difficult. Maybe one can say it is impossible that the Indian Maoism will ever graduate to the mobile warfare phase. And coming to the Maoist in India, it started after the merger in 2004. Okay, by 2011 and 12, you have the Maoist presence, okay, moderate, high, and extreme in 10 states with 188 districts. But then now if you come down, you will find 81 critically affected districts. And this is the map for you. Okay, the red patches, what you see, these are the extremely affected area, and this is the area where Maharashtra, Telangana, Odisha, and Chhattisgarh sort of, this is the belt where they are very, very active. And the Siliguri movement that I was discussing with Satishji, this is where the Maoists have their presence, and this is the strategic location. Otherwise, if you see, most of the areas the Maoists have either lost their kind of control over the people, or they have not been able to garner their support from the people, or the security forces have completely wiped them out. Okay, coming to the dynamics of the left-wing extremism, this is what the official name of the Maoist thing in India. When you see their ideology, this ideology is very bookish in nature. Okay, you see that that documents, if you read, this is as usual, very age-old kind of things. They say that they follow Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist ideas of revolution. But academics, they said that the Marxist, Leninist to Maoist, there is no continuity. There is a lot of kind of contradictions. This thing. But then this is a wonderful phrase which actually brings a lot of kind of attention, or it is glorified to the extent that it catches the imagination of the people, that it is a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist ideas of revolution. And that is where they say the protracted people's war to seize political power. What it signifies is that the Maoists are not in a hurry. That is what some of the my experience, I would say, some of the Maoist camps, they would say that we are not in a hurry, and this is a protracted battle, okay, to fight against the state and to fight against the injustice, okay. And there is, theoretically, they say they're fighting contradictions, the contradictions between the rich and the poor, the contradictions of the mass and the elite. These are some kind of theoretical things they actually offer. But the real danger comes when they actually start delegitimizing or rejecting the idea of democracy in the Indian state. They said that the levels of democracy or the parliamentary form of governance that India follows is absolutely sham, and it is based on the semi-feudal and the semi-colonial nature. Why do they call the semi-feudal? Because they see that the entire level of political governance that we have, it is run by the feudal, and it is semi-colonial because we are not free from any sort of kind of foreign invasion or the foreign control. We are still controlled by those colonial mindset. Okay, and they say the parliament or the democratic nature of governance that we have is actually an instrument of exploitation of the marginalized people. Okay, so that is where, what is the way out for them? So they say there is a revolutionary objective for which they have taken up arms. Okay, and through this revolution, they want to establish a classless society. And this is something that is a very, very Marxian way of actually putting things, a classless society, but they fail to define what a classless society would be. Okay, and then the second thing is that the establishment of new democratic order. And this is something very confusing, that you have a well-established kind of democracy. It's recognized worldwide that this democracy has never failed, okay, for last 70 odd years. But then the new democratic order is also ill-defined in the Maoist thing. If we get into the phases of Indian militant communism, that you say, like, as you say, that the organization party and the Revolutionary United Front, the organizational phase was actually started in 1967 to 72. That was the time, if you see, there was actually wide spread of ideological kind of militancy from Naxalbari to Musahari district to to Kheda, Lakshmipur, to Debra, to Srikakulam, to Koraput in Odisha. That is where you will see the Maoist had this kind, the Naxalites, those they used to call them. They had the kind of ideological base, or they spread ideologically to these areas, and that is where the motive was to identify the class enemy. Basically, those who actually oppose the idea of the so-called idea of revolution, and to annihilate them. That is where indiscriminate killing was happening. This was evident from Srikakulam, Parvatipuram agency. This was also evident in Musahari districts of Bihar. It was evident in Naxalbari, in Koraput, in Malkanagiri of Odisha. But then from 1975, but then by 1972, there was a kind of a state action against all these people. But by 1975, what you see, there was a rise of factions. Now, I must tell you, factionalism is a darling. Factionalism is very dear to the communist. If you see the Indian communist movement, more than the militant communism and the so-called democratic communists, you will see factionalism is an inseparable kind of thing in their organization. But then by 2080, by 1980s, what we saw, that there was emergence of two very powerful kind of factions. That was the People's War Group operating in undivided Andhra Pradesh, okay, and some parts of bordering Odisha, and then to the extent of undivided Bihar, okay. But then this was MCCI, Maoist Communist Center, actually operating in jungle mahals of West Bengal and Bihar. But then, with the creation of Jharkhand, what we saw, there was a lot of kind of infighting, factional fighting among the Maoists, and that is where the ideologues of sitting in Hyderabad, sitting in Delhi, sitting in Bhubaneswar, they decided that all these factions needs to come together to have a kind of organized or a merged way of fighting against the Indian state. That is how the CPI Maoist was formed in 2004. And once it was actually merged, what we saw starting from 2004 to 2010, that is the time when we actually witnessed the escalation of violence. And that is when we felt that this is a major threat to the Indian state, and that forced Manmohan Singh to go on record to say that the Maoism is a biggest internal security threat to the state of India. But then, by 2010-11, we had a concrete plan. The Indian state had a concrete plan, to take on the Maoist, following a security-centric approach. That was the time from 2010-11. We saw there is a decline. There is a decline in the Maoist related violent activities in all these areas. And this is also because of the killing and arrest and surrender of leaders and the cadres. And slowly, the most important thing which the state and many of the civil society organizations do not actually write in their documents, that the local people who initially supported this Maoist, they also started withdrawing their support. And I'll tell you why. Okay, and this is where you see by 2013-14 there was a tribal assertion against the Maoist, and this was actually very, very evident in Jharkhand. This was very evident in Odisha, in some parts of Chhattisgarh as well. The tribal leadership actually started questioning the very legitimacy of the Maoist. Coming to the idea of this violence, there is a body of civil society organizations and the left-leaning intellectuals in India. You will see that they constantly keep on legitimizing the violence that is carried on by the Maoist. The books written by Manoranjan Mahanti and other people. So by 1976-77, Manoranjan Mahanti would come up with a book called The Revolutionary Violence. Okay, the revolutionary violence, meaning this violence by the Maoist is not without a cause, hence is a legitimate kind of violence. Okay, that is where even today you see whatever the kind of the violent activities carried on by the Maoist is very, very it's in a very organized manner, sort of legitimized by certain section of the media, certain section of the civil society and the intellectuals. And that is where the Maoist violence is also guided by the retributive violence, where they say this is a violence to counter the state violence. Okay, and that is where they give a false sense of empowerment to the locals, especially between 2004 to 2010. That here is we are offering you a kind of an empowerment, or we are empowering you to actually kill these people, okay, to take vendetta, and that is where you feel very powerful. Okay, but in this process, what had happened, that the violence has gone overboard. Okay, many of these innocent tribals have also been mercilessly, ruthlessly killed by the Maoist. Okay, that is where what Subbarao Panigrahi in 1971 actually told in a kind of encounter with Charu Majumdar, that we cannot indiscriminately killing people in the name of revolution. And that is the time when Charu Majumdar was asked by Subbarao Panigrahi to leave Srikakulam. He said that this is not something that you will understand what is the idea of revolution. Okay, but then this idea of indiscriminate killing is very much part of the Maoist kind of movement in India. That is where one would see there is a broad distinction with the acts of terrorism. The inhuman kind of brutalities. If you see, this can give a tough competition to some of the ISIS ways of killing that we see in the media. People, the tribals have been actually, their throats have been cut. Okay, there are evidences in the Bichananchal in Odisha where the women was skinned alive. Those kind of things are very much part of this violent activities. This brings me to the urban movement, and this is something, this was felt by 1980s. you would all appreciate that this is a movement by starting from Naxalbari. This was actually designed to have its base in the rural India, to fight the feudals, to fight the jamindars and the petty bourgeois, what they say in a Marxist terminology. Okay. But then, by 2004, it was felt. It was first initially felt in 1980s that we should have people in the urban areas who would provide us some sort of legitimacy. Okay, and in that process, we'll also garner support from other people. Okay, so then by 2004, when the merger took place, okay, they felt there has to be a strong army, strong party, and a united front. And the whole aspect of a united front, that is where the urban movement actually comes. Okay, that is where they say we need to have tactical united front activities in the urban areas. And how do you actually forge alliance? You forge alliance with the people who have a kind of, certain reservations against the state, who reject the ideas of the state, okay, and who are ready to sort of fight, if not completely in a violent way, but in the ideation level to fight the state. Okay, that is where they write in that strategic plan 2004 document. They say the centers of struggle by various classes under the leadership of several organizations representing them. And it is essential that we unite with such struggling organizations and build up broad struggles against the ruling classes. This is very, very appealing kind of theoretical background, which actually romanticizes the idea of revolution. And a lot of the young minds, starting from universities where I studied or elsewhere, you will see people talk about fighting against the ruling class. But then this is a very faulty kind of thing. During the discussion, we can actually take up. And this urban movement plan, this is where many of the civil society organizations actually come, and they sort of try to give a kind of positive image to the Maoist radicals, saying that they are fighting for the rights and the entitlements for the marginalized kind of people. What are the issues around this? In one hand, you have a very robust democracy and a very successful kind of democracy, maybe few black episodes during emergency here and there, but then Indian democracy has been uninterruptedly, it has been a successful story so far, given its diversity and all kind of thing, is versus a radical and militant kind of communism. This is one of the issues. The second issue that we see, that the rights and the entitlements of the people, if you go to this tribal belt, what we say, not necessarily the red corridor, but the tribal belt, there are certain genuine issues of rights and the entitlements of the local people. But then the Maoist representing these grievances, okay, on the rights and the entitlements of the local people is a misplaced or a completely misplaced kind of an argument, because the rights and the entitlements of the people, the Maoist cannot actually ensure. It can be ensured only by the state. But however, there is also this development-induced displacement, then the question of representation. That is where somewhere the state has to own up, okay, across the party line, they have to own up that the Maoist claim representing these people, because the state has been absent. Okay, of late, the Indian state has actually intervened in these areas in terms of, constructing roads, by establishing schools and other governance mechanisms. But till 2000, 2001, we'll see that the state was somehow absent there. But in that process, the Maoists had actually taken advantage of that thing. But it took the Indian government till 2014. It was only after Modi government came to power in 2014. This was explicitly mentioned in the Ministry of Home Affairs website that the Maoists have taken the advantage of certain loopholes of the state. Okay, this was something that for the first time the state actually acknowledged. That is where you'll see that the Modi government in 2015, in a response to the Maoist thing, there is one important policy was inserted here, that ensuring the rights and the entitlements of the local people, which was completely absent till 2015. Okay, then who are the stakeholders in this fighting? You see that the major two stakeholders, that at the abstract level one can see the Maoist and the Indian state, but then if you get into very close, you'll see there is an unholy alliance between the government officials, the Maoist and the contractors in one side, and the local people on the other. Coming to the state responses, I'll not take much time on this thing. There has been a very robust security approach. Okay, there are also been development initiative following the 2008 document by the erstwhile Planning Commission. Then the important one is ensuring rights and the entitlements of the local people. This is a contribution of the Modi government in 2015, and this is where, when the tribal welfare affair minister was Joel Oram, he took a lot of initiative in providing a land registration document to a lot of tribal people. And this is also an important aspect and an important factor why Maoism actually reduced 2015 to 2020. If you see 2019-20, there is a lot of these tribal people who actually got their patta, the registration of the land records. They slowly started withdrawing their support from the Maoist. And then, India has a very robust kind of surrender and a rehabilitation policy. But then, in the process of all this, somehow the fifth schedule provisions of giving certain special power to the local people to decide their kind of governance model has not been implemented in its letter and spirit. But then the last thing, as an academic, I would see that the negotiation aspect is not been completely exploited. Now this is something that needs to be this needs to be explored more. What is the future course of left-wing extremism or the Maoism in India? I would say that it from a biggest internal threat to Indian state, it has come to a major irritant. And this has been the journey of the Maoist. Okay, it is on a terminal decline. It is limited, as I told you, certain pockets in the Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand. There are multiple factions. As I told you, factionalism is very inseparable to all these things. But it has an impact at the perception level. Wherever the state or the government or the governance mechanism fails to a certain extent, okay, they feel that the Maoist is kind of, there is a possibility that the Maoist is a potential kind of, force which can ensure them certain justice. Okay, in that process, what we see in last 5-10 years, the Maoists have also deviated from their so-called revolutionary objectives. Okay, now the academic papers, policy briefs are emerging across the globe. They find that it has converted itself into an organized criminal group, and it is only limited to the extortion money and all that. And Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh is a classic example. But at the same time, as they are not in a hurry, they believe in the protracted kind of thing, they'll continue to take advantage of these governance loopholes here and there. Coming to the human rights situation. Okay, this Human Rights Watch wrote in 2015. They say that the local people between two sets of guns. Okay, now the same thing you'll see. All these civil society organizations or who claim to champion the rights or the entitlements of the local and marginalized people, they always sort of present to a one-sided kind of story. Of course, the local people have been between the two sets of the guns, but the one set of guns, literally controlled by the Maoist, they have been very, very unfair to the local people. Okay, that is where you will see that there is a systematic exploitation of the tribal. Okay, how it is that the tribal areas in this the entire tribal belt, you will see there is a diversity of identity of the tribals. Okay, there is the multiple tribal identities are there. But in the process of this so-called revolution, there is an imposed kind of identity over the tribals. Or the tribals are not called as a Santal or a Munda or a Parja or a Kandh or a Kui or a Gondi. Okay, they are all called as comrades now. Okay, in that process, the Maoists have created an atmosphere of fear, Okay, to the extent that the tribals are not, or the other marginalized communities in these areas, they have not been able to think very independently. Anthropological studies actually offer you this kind of insights that the tribals and the other the forest dwellers in these areas, they have been very, very independent thinking people. Okay, but with the in the name of revolution, okay, this has actually diluted that right of thinking independently by the Maoist. In that process, what you see that the tribals or the Maoist in the name of revolution, they have also taken over, okay, the land and the other genuine grievances of the people. So, for example, one thing I'll tell you, the tendu leaves that is actually being collected in these forest areas, now it is not the tribal or the other marginalized communities, okay, or the forest dwellers who decide a rate, okay, and who decide a kind of contractor who he would say. Okay, it is decided by the Maoist. Okay, in that process, what the Maoists do, that whatever the money they get from the contractor, okay, some amount of the money is kept for the so-called revolutionary purpose, and the other thing actually distributed to the local people. Similarly, in Odisha, what you see, the Chasimulia Adivasi Sangh, which was actually mobilized by the Maoists to reclaim their land from the local zamindars and all that. Later stage the tribal found that, or the other marginalized people, they found that the Maoists have taken over the entire 6,000 acres of the land, and this is very fertile land where you have this lemongrass cultivations and all that, without any investment. Each acre gives you 60,000 rupees profit every year. And they found that the Maoists are calling the shot to the extent that how much of production from the land a particular family will get will be decided by the revolutionary cause. And a substantial amount of this product from this thing in terms of money actually goes to the Maoist. To that extent, you will see the atmosphere of fear has also systematically been exploiting the tribals. In that process, we have the imposed representation over the local population. Okay, and in that process, what we see, the involvement of the civil society organizations and the legitimization of violence, I have told you, but some of these classic cases where the civil society organizations from my own state, so people like Praful Samantray, Dandapani Mahanti, and all these people, they keep on writing in the local media, in the local dialects, and all these things that the Maoists are a kind of a solution to the injustice or the so-called injustice, okay, that the state has actually created for the people. In that process, what we see in terms of there has been the local institutions have also been neglected. Okay, so when we are talking about the civil society organizations, there is a very notorious politics here. And the civil society organizations that are actually involved in legitimizing the violence, they are either Hyderabad-based or Delhi-based or Bangalore-based. To put it in a conceptual, they are urban-based civil society organizations like Arundhati Roy kind of people. Okay, who are completely ignorant about the local dynamics. Okay, I have my personal encounter with many of these people. They do not know how a Gunda and a Poraja are actually different from each other. Okay, they also put the tribals into one particular bracket. Okay, but then there are genuine local institutions who are actually fighting for the rights and entitlements of the multiple groups in terms of their water resources, in terms of their land. They are completely sidelined. Okay, in that process, whoever actually opposes this revolution is actually given the label of a class enemy. And that is where I end. For all this human right kind of situation, there is a failure of the state. There is a failure of the state to the extent that it has substantially failed in securitizing the people. Okay, the people it actually represent. Okay, to that extent, there is a failure of the state. Okay, I'll not be completely unfair, but then it will not be completely fair to say that the state has actually been able to delegitimize the Maoist thing in the psyche of the people, which is completely based on atmosphere of fear. So I stop here. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. If there are any discussions and comments and questions, I'll be happy to take them forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anshumanji. Thank you for those wonderful remarks and a very studied intervention as from your side. So I will be very happy now to introduce our panel and other guests with you to discuss about this particular issue. So we have Professor Kashinath Pandita, who will talk about it from a human rights perspective. Professor Pandita is an academician, a well-known name in the academic circles. He was born in Jammu Kashmir and who is president of Asia Eurasia Human Rights Forum. He was awarded a UGC Emeritus Fellowship for Central Asian Studies in 78 to 88 and President and Vice President of India in 1985 and 87 for his academic attainments has awarded him that fellowship. Also, he has received the highest civilian award of Indian government, which is Padma Shri, and he is our president of this particular organization. We have we have Alok Bansal, who is Executive Director of South Asian Institute of Strategic Affairs and also Director of India Foundation. He has authored several books. So he'll be talking about this issue from security perspective. And in order to, we also felt that media is a crucial element of in covering all these issues. So we are very pleased to also have Mr. Praful Ketkar, who is editor of Organizer, which is Bharat Prakashan Delhi Limited, which is Bharat Prakashan Delhi Limited organization. And so we will be basically covering it from academic perspective, from human rights perspective, from security perspective, and from media perspective. So what I'll do now is I'll request all the panelists, starting from Professor Pandita, followed by Mr. Praful Ketkar, and then Mr. Alok Bansal, to give their brief intervention for 2 minutes, and then we will move towards question and answers, and I will ask certain questions to the panel so that we flesh out some of these issues. So starting with you, Professor Pandita, please, your couple of minutes of intervention on all these issues.
I must congratulate you for organizing this wonderful webinar and beginning with a very learned presentation by our panelists, which has been touching almost all important aspects of the issue. I think that the issue is so big that one cannot do justice to it in one go, but still it is enlightening to know some of the major aspects that have been thrown up. The fundamental question is the composition of the segment of population in our country, which has been forced to take up arms and launch an armed confrontation with the government under the name of, in whatever name, nationalism or Maoism or whatever. Perhaps somewhere our socio-economic structuring of the country needs to be brought under drastic reforms so that the disparity in income, disparity in classes is reduced to the lowest level. That perhaps is one of the reasons why we have this commotion of nationalism and Maoism in our country. The second point which I would like to make is that as we know, Maoism essentially comprises three elements. it wants to capture the fundamental aim is to capture state power for introducing the democracy of its own type. For capturing state power, there are three instruments which they are following. One is armed insurgency. So they legitimize armed insurgency against the state. And the second is mass mobilization. To mobilize the masses through indoctrination, through brainwashing, through creation of fear, suspicion, whatever, so that their movement is numerically strengthened by the people. And third is strategic alliance, to develop strategic alliances. Developing strategic alliances is what we may very easily say that even in our parliament, we have the sympathizers. The MPs are the sympathizers. In states, MLAs are sympathizers. The ministers are, some of the ministers are sympathizers. So a whole group of sympathizers has been created who plead their cause. My predecessor has touched upon the human rights aspect, which is very important from my point of view. Now, human rights is something which is universal according to the Charter of the United Nations Human Rights, 1948. And it states that even a criminal has the human rights. His human rights have to be valued. In 2018, Maharashtra police arrested 5 people on the charges that they were supporting Maoism. The court set them free and said that dissent is the very spirit of democracy. In 2011, 5 eminent persons were arrested in Chhattisgarh. I'll take their names so that the matter is clear to you. Number 1 was Ramachandra Guha, the historian, an academic. Then there was social activist, Mr. Sundar. And then there was another social activist, Swami Agnivesh. And lastly, there was an ex-bureaucrat, A.S. Sarma. Because they were writing for the human rights of the Naxalites and the Maoists, they had been picked up, but the Supreme Court released them with a very scathing remarks against the state, saying that to be a dissident never meant to be a Maoist. They have been the dissidents of the state policy, state political system, but they cannot be considered as Maoists. Now, the question comes up. How is the government going to tackle this issue? Because we have the democratic government. And the democratic government of India, and India being a signatory to the Charter of Human Rights, cannot overrule the human rights clauses and deal with the Maoists and Naxalites by using brute force. Though the brute force has been used, the question is, when the Maoists say that this power is to be seized through armed intervention, what is a democratic government going to do? How is it going to respond to it? I have very closely watched this situation in Kashmir, where whenever the militants, the terrorists attacked the border force, the army, and other paramilitary installations, nobody raised any voice. But whenever the forces retaliated in self-defense, there was a lot of hue and cry. And all the NGOs in Kashmir, outside Kashmir, and even big NGOs like Amnesty International and other NGOs, they raised a hue and cry that the human rights were violated. And the famous axiom we have that a terrorist of one person is a freedom fighter of another person. In the case of Maoists and Naxalites, the fundamental issue is that of the government taking natural resources ruthlessly under the pretext of development. The government thinks that no progress can happen unless there's all-round development. And for development, you need land, you need natural resources, you need manpower. So when these elements are taken over by the government and used under the pretext of bringing about development, because without development, these backward classes, the tribal classes, the Naxalites, the deprived classes, the poor classes, their lot cannot be changed. So it boils down to be an economic, social issue. How best the government can strike a balance, like giving compensation for the lands and the resources that have been used, and whether that works or not. For instance, in the case of Kashmir, I remember the natural resources. There have been so many verdicts by the courts, even by high courts and administration, that the sand drawn from the riverbeds, which are dried, should not be vandalized. Despite all these verdicts by the court and actions by the police, the menace of misusing the natural resource of sand has not stopped.
Yeah.
So this is a question which has to be tackled at various levels. So I think these are some of the observations which I would like to make in the context of what has been said and what might be further elucidated by other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pandita. Thank you for your intervention, and thank you for your very astute observations about the issues. And we will definitely come to some of them in the question and answer session. And as you mentioned, it's a socio-economic issue, and the way in which media has covered this socio-economic issue, we would like to hear first couple of minutes from Praful Ketkarji on this. This is a very good way to have a segue to Praful Ketkarji. So Praful Ketkarji, your couple of minutes of intervention, please. Prafulji, you are on mute.
Thank you, Yashodanji, and thank you, Dr. Behera, for that, covering the entire Maoist movement comprehensively. Uh, I have just 3 points to make. And in fact, one of them is in the form of more sort of question, and I would like to have a clarification from your side. See, for me, Maoist movement was always an urban movement. Urban Naxal is, the term that has used and overused recently. But what has changed from 2004 perhaps is that the frontal organizations are actually created and used as a change strategy because they lost ground in the rural and tribal areas. But the leadership and the ideological mentoring of the entire movement was always urban. In fact, I have traveled in some of the Maoist belts of Maharashtra and Chhattisgarh border, and I didn't find a single uh, 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 person who is a forest dweller and know anything about either Marx or Lenin or Mao. Their issues are totally different. These so-called Maoists are just encashing on their sentiments and misdirecting them towards the state. This is my understanding. Second issue is more a sort of, as Yashodanji has talked about the media. Thanks to this, urban character, I have a fundamental issue that is ideological. As Karl Popper has talked about the paradox of intolerance, this is a paradox of democracy, paradox of human rights. You want to give all kinds of human rights or constitutional rights to the people who essentially do not believe in human rights and your constitution. In fact, they want to overthrow this constitution. That is the fundamental objective. How to deal with this situation? You also spoke about, and perhaps Manoranjan Mohanty also, in my, as a political science student, I've read him talking about the state failure. But sorry, the state was not even allowed to enter there. All the development activities are actually stopped by the Maoists. And most importantly, I thank that you mentioned about the decentralization of power and Panchayati Raj. But I know for sure, and Professor Pandita mentioned about Professor Nalini Sundar. She is one of the accused in killing of a panchayat leader who is elected sarpanch. She is a professor in JNU. Her husband is a media baron and controlling most of the media narratives for last 20-25 years. And he was killed for contesting elections, standing against the Maoist directive not to contest the election. That was his crime. And they're talking about democracy. So how to deal with this paradox where state is not allowed to take up the inclusionary developmental activities hampered by the entire Maoist movement? The third aspect, I think, in the present situation is more important, and I would like to have your opinion on this, is related to China, because that is the ideological, fountainhead of Maoism, and that has seen, changes over the period of time with unique Chinese characteristics. From Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin and now Xi Jinping, from classical, unclear Maoism to now unclear state controlled capitalism. But if I'm not wrong, sir, in 2003 until 2003-4 at least, or especially when Encamposa took place. The South Asian Alliance was envisaged. China had a clear-cut role to play as far as arming, training, and giving ideological inspiration to all these movements. And in Nepal, there was a clear-cut intervention. And somehow, if you see, the Chinese human rights violations are never discussed or criticized by the so-called Maoist intellectuals. In fact, they will whitewash it. So this is one important aspect. And the second aspect that is emerging that you mentioned about the Bangladesh situation, the new alliance that is emerging between the Maoist and the Islamists or Islamic fundamentalists. It may be a a tactical alliance, as Mao would have said, but I would like to know your understanding, because that alliance is definitely not working in the situation of Xinjiang in case of Uyghurs. So how are we going to settle with this, the intolerant, violent, undemocratic, ideological construct, which is fundamentally fighting against the democratic framework, and we have to fight with them democratically? That is, I think, perhaps the biggest challenge. So what are the ways in the urban areas as well as actual, on the ground where they are armed? I know the situation in Bastar where CRPF camps are proposed, and more than 5,000 people are camping there because of Maoist diktat, and the basic fundamental activities. And one of the deadliest, attack that was taken place on India's democratically elected leaders of Chhattisgarh, who themselves were tribals. And the leader who is camping there, they are essentially blocking this, entire CRPF thing to block the developmental activities, and also, so that the CRPF cannot get hold of this person. So what is the, how to dealing these ideological inhuman constructs who do not believe in democratic rights? I would like to have your take on this, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Prafulji. Thank you for so wonderfully and succinctly putting up this paradox of democracy which we have. And thank you for also mentioning some of the international relation related dynamics and international relation related issues here, and mention of Sharia Bolshevism. Another very important point which you mentioned was about role of CRPF, and I would like Alok Bansalji to make comments about it from internal security perspective, and then we have lots and lots of questions from audience. I am very sure that they are very our audience are very enthused by your initial remarks by all of you. So Alokji, your opinion about internal security.
Well, we are thank you, Yashodanji. We are well past 9:30, or originally slated closing in time. So I would try to be as brief as possible. I'll just make 3 points which I just wanted to say. Anshuman said factionalism is common to Maoists. In fact, I have always believed that more radical an ideology, lesser is the tolerance for ambiguity. So any radical ideology will lead to greater fractures. You could see Islamists, you could see Maoists, you could see anybody. Because more radical an ideology is, you're not willing to accept even a slight deviation. And this is, of course, a very big chink in the armor of any radical ideology. And this can always be exploited if you tap it well. But for that, you need to understand the ideology always well. That's a very important thing. Secondly, there is no doubt that bulk of the tribals who are actually now fighting for the Maoists are not Maoists. They don't understand Marx and Lenin. But the fact is, they have had certain genuine grievances which have not been assuaged for decades. Praveer Chand Bhanjadev was killed in 1965. I have lived for 10 years in Bastar. Now, it was the most peaceful area till 70s. Now, it's been actually turned into a violent area. Now, there are, because justice is what is important. Now, there is a perception, right or wrong, that justice is not being delivered. Now, that is what is important, and Maoists have managed to tap into this discontent. Now we need to bring in certain system whereby the justice is expeditiously delivered to those tribals who are actually illiterate, poor, at the margins of the society. Now this justice has to be prompt and correct. Unfortunately, our bureaucratized polity and corruption, endemic corruption, have often contributed to denying justice to them. And last point I'd like to talk about CRPF and camping of 5,000 people. The fact is the CRPF, or for that matter, any central police organization in India, is neither geared nor trained to fight the Naxal menace. Unfortunately, all these CRPF units are headed by IPS officers who come on lateral induction without having known either the men or the terrain or the job. We had the last incident where a large number of CRPF men were killed. Not a single senior officer was present. Is that acceptable? Is that the type of leadership that you want to go and engage committed guerrilla outfits? Not to my mind. The CRPF people are pitchforked from Kashmir to Chhattisgarh overnight, or from Assam to Telangana overnight, and are expected to fight without understanding the terrain. And the biggest and the worst problem is they don't even understand their officers who have been brought in overnight from some other different cadre and appointed as their bosses. Now, those officers are used to policing in the districts where they are the big sahibs. They don't know how to move around in the jungles, lead their men. Now, that basic tactics of how to indulge in a counter guerrilla operations is lacking. Now, with that sort of a thing, you are bound to have fiascos like this. I think a time has come. We need to look at the reorganization of the CPOs. The CPOs today are in dire need of reorganization. In fact, the whole police structure is in dire need of reorganization. Now, this is as far as the tactical issue is concerned. Most of the other issues, as you know, have been covered. But I felt this was very important because people must know that as long as we keep depending on CRPF, which is led by IPS officers who come on deputation from various states, you are going to have, unfortunately, such tragic results that you are going to see that happen in that particular incident. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll be clubbing some of the questions in order to kind of save some time. And my next question will be to Dr. Behera. So thanks, Alokji, for mentioning about some of the tactical issues. But also we would like to think a little more about strategy here. And when we are thinking about long-term strategy, we want to have some people-centric approach. And as you said, like justice and human rights probably were the issues there. So what is the impact on the society there? What about the socio-economic indicators of the human development index of the society in those Naxal affected or Maoism affected areas? And that's what I would like to hear from Dr. Behera. Dr. Behera, your comments on this question.
Yeah, thank you, Yashodhanji. I would also like to thank Professor Pandit, Prafulji, and Alok sir for their wonderful remarks. Okay, this also brings an important aspect. You know, I absolutely take all these points made by the very responsible scholars here. But then one important thing that what Praful Ketkarji also mentioned, the impact on the society, what the Maoists have done. Okay, this also actually links up to the very, very wonderfully conceptualized by Alok sir. That the more the radical a particular organization, there is more possibility of a slight deviation. There is a faction, and this is what actually is the impact of the society. Where you have the Maoist presence. Okay, so you have the example where Nandini Sundar was responsible for killing of a sarpanch. You will also be very, very disturbed to know in 2009, we had somebody called Arjun Kendruka in Koraput, who also actually fought the general election and was brutally killed by the Maoist in the post-election. Okay, and that is where you will see that the society in the Maoist affected areas are completely divided. Okay, so you have the examples of the Kandhamal riot. Okay, people give it a religious color of the Hindu versus the Christians. But let me tell you, as a social scientist and who have been actually following this for last 2 decades, I have been n number of times I've gone to Kandhamal. There was a wonderful kind of social bonding among the Kandhas and the Panas. Okay, the Panas are the scheduled caste and the Kandhas are the tribals. Okay, where the arrangement was like the Kandha Raja Pana Mantri, that the Kandhas are the kings and their brain are the Panas. Okay, this was the social kind of thing. With the Maoist, I have the recordings. I have also placed it before Nandini Sundar, the so-called experts on Maoism, that how the Maoist actually used the Pentecostals to kill Lakshmanananda Saraswati. We have the recordings. We have the recordings of the people who actually killed. Okay, so that is where you see the artificial division that the Maoists have created in the Kandhamal starting from 2008. It took actually solid 10 years for us to bring a kind of conciliation kind of thing among all these people. By 2017-18, they started talking to each other. This is the contribution of the Maoist. Similarly, if you come to the Narayanpatna areas of Odisha, where my next book is coming up, where the Dumbas, another scheduled caste group, actually have been completely displaced by the Kandhas. Okay, and they are all taking shelter. Some 600 families are taking shelter in the rehabilitation camps in Koraput, Jaipur, all these areas. Okay, this was unheard of in the forest areas of India, where the marginalized communities actually lived peacefully. That is where you, when you go to Koraput museum, you will see that when the Pandits visited the forest areas, okay, they make a mockery of the intellectual, saying that they are artificially creating the divisions among, and the Maoists have actually contributed enormously to these areas. Okay, so then coming to the human development aspects, you will be very happy to know that, okay, the demands of these people. Okay, when I say these people, I'm not othering. I'm putting them in a very high place. Okay, the demands of these our own people there, okay, is very less. Okay, they have not demanded the things that is what the so-called people living in the urban areas do demand. Okay, the demands are not unfair. The demands are the simple things. What are the Jal, Jameen and Jungle? Okay, now that what we have seen, that thanks to the Maoist, okay, they have given them the kind of false hope that they are fighting for them. In that process, they have captured their natural resources. So that is one hand, there is a larger perception that somehow the state has unfairly taken their land, what Professor Kasi Pandit was mentioning, that for the development purposes and all that. Okay, I would say there was a communication failure starting from 1948 till date. Okay, there has been a communication failure, and in this communication failure, the civil society organizations, okay, the so-called civil society organizations based in Delhi or the urban centers, they have played a major role in actually giving a false impression of the state. Okay, the Utkal Aluminium is a classic example. Okay, and I failed to understand in 2002 to 2003, all this time, what was the job of Arundhati Roy sitting in a small village in Utkal Aluminium, in Kashipadar and all these things. Okay, people, hold her in a high esteem, but then when I started asking the people, last couple of years, okay, they say that she would actually give them few money, okay, and, they will campaign against the Tatas and the Birlas and the Mahindras. So that is where the human development, if you see, the health index is superb. Okay, you and me, okay, if I go by the so-called the modern way of talking about the human development and all these things, you will not find them very sick. Okay, maybe the modern way of understanding human development they lack because they do not have cash in the bank. Okay, but then they don't need it. Okay, they have never complained for it. Okay, and there is a lot of this thing during when I was working in IDSA, that was a lot of debate that we need to bring development here. And this is the whole paradigm of development needs to be rethought. Okay, the whole identity of the tribal will go for a toss if you bring in so much of development. They don't need development. Okay, but at the same time, the Maoists do not represent them. Okay, that is something that needs to be very, very clear in the mind. There is a faulty development model. Yes, there is. But then there is a lack of communication. This needs to be sorted out. Okay. And how do you do it? Coming to Prabhul Ketkarji's thing, how do you do it? And then you do it when you take the local elites into confidence. Talk to the tribal leaders. Okay. We have not been able to talk to them. We have failed in certain ways in talking to the tribal leaders. We need to talk to them. Okay, and how do you talk to them? One thing is recruit their own people from their own society. Okay, simplifying the provisions of democracy to them. Okay, this is, we are running out of time. There is a lot of thing I can say, where they are given money in the paper notes, with the tribal never understood, the three into the Kaveri and the Kembek. What to do with this? Okay, these are classic, the Machkund area, the Upper Kolab kind of thing. And you need a local guy who would actually translate all these things. And this is somewhere, we have failed. Okay, thank you.
I have one question for Prafulji. Actually, it is said that local people don't support these kind of activities there, violent activities there, and media never really reports it. There is also a little bit of criticism of media that it sometimes romanticizes the violent Maoist movement, and that impacts the Human Development Index. Why it is so, and where media is going wrong?
There are two aspects to this issue, Yashodhanji. As one of the very high-profile celebrity journalists has once used for the Northeast, the tyranny of distance. So most of the people do not even try to access. I know many Marathi journalists or Odia journalists, going to these areas and having access even with the locals. They have a, but unfortunately it never becomes a national kind of coverage. It is a very localized kind of coverage. So denial of human rights to the state is covered at the national level, because these frontal organizations and the ideological mentors are sitting here either in media houses or NGOs or civil society activist groups in the name of human rights. So they will always talk about the state suppression of human rights, but they will never talk about the Maoist suppression of human rights. In fact, that perspective was even never allowed to develop. You cannot even ask about why, this Pathalgadi kind of thing, where outsiders not allowed to, enter. Why, central schemes are not allowed to be implemented as far as the development aspects are concerned. Maoists have, literally bulldoze many connectivity programs in these tribal areas, including the mobile towers. Now, that can be discussed and debated whether tribals really need mobiles. But as far as I know, they don't have internet, but they have mobiles. And if you communicate something, in fact, many of the tribals from Bastar area, they now come to Raipur, store their songs or even news in Gondi, and then go back to their villages. So there can be certain gaps, and that needs to be. But the obstacle now is perhaps the Maoists themselves and the way Maoists are functioning. The second aspect is more of a this Maoist terror also. Because many of the times, even if you try, perhaps these locals will not speak about the trauma they are going through. They want to get out of this. They don't want this, bloodshed, because they are literally being sandwiched from both the sides, and they want to get out of it. But there is an element of terror. So it's a very precarious situation when it comes to the real human rights, because otherwise, what is the reason that these so-called civil society activists are having control over tribal land? They are having they have got their own plush constructions there, but state agencies cannot do that. It's a very, and as Dr. Behera also said, the land acquired, it actually started with the land distribution issue. Now that is completely gone. It is a criminal syndicate that is working with a parallel economy and parallel model of governance. But unfortunately, media is either blind towards it, or not able to access to the atrocities committed by the Maoists on the tribals.
Thank you. My question to Alokji is actually Prafulji has raised a very important and interesting point, and couple of people on the chat also are asking about it. Why not call them terrorists simply? If they're committing the violence, because there is an aspect of terror, as Prafulji is mentioning, and whether the similar strategies, Alokji, from a security perspective, will be useful. And there is also a mention that there is attempt to legitimize the violence. And as human rights organization, our fundamental building block is peace and human development and other things. So how can someone legitimize the violence, and how can someone counter such a strategy in order to bring the peace there? And what should be our strategic approach to all these things? You are on mute, I guess, Alokji.
Firstly, we need to distinguish between the foot soldiers and the ideologues of the movement. If somebody is actually guilty of terrorism, it is the ideologues and the leadership of the movement, which are actually instigating these foot soldiers to indulge in wanton acts of violence. The fact is, foot soldiers have genuine grouses, they don't understand, and they have been driven. Now, if you actually start treating the foot soldiers who are the poor tribals as your enemies, then you will be actually alienating them. And that's where it is not prudent. It's neither advisable nor a prudent thing. Yes, as far as the leadership is concerned, those who are committed hardcore, in fact, it's feasible to actually, if you actually can explain your viewpoint to the tribals, you can actually win them over. And I agree with Prafulji that one of the reasons why the Maoists are not allowing development there is because they know that if the development comes in, the poor tribals will be aware of what's happening. And then this Maoist propaganda will fall flat. Also with the development, probably, now this is actually a hope that probably with the development that comes in, they would be also in a position to get expeditious justice. As I told you, justice is a very, very key issue. And I think a tribesman, a tribal individual must get that feeling that they're getting the justice. That part has to actually come. And to that extent, the bureaucracy that exists in those areas needs to be sensitized to this need for an expeditious justice. We cannot have these delayed cases lingering on for decades, for generations, without justice being delivered. That's one issue which I think needs to be.
Thank you, Alokji. So we are almost coming to close. So I'll request closing remarks, and I'll raise a couple of important questions. It's a very wide and big topic, actually, and there are several facets to it. And Alokji raised the issue of justice, and also Dr. Behera raised the issue of negotiations. And so there are human rights violations happening there. There are some political ideologies at work which are impacting the Human Development Index, and then there has to be a expeditious justice from the bureaucracy. And one of the solutions Dr. Bahiraji very kindly mentioned was negotiations. Having said that, I would like to raise my skepticism here a little bit, and then also would like to invite closing remarks from Prafulji and Dr. Bahiraji. Recently, as recent as a couple of days back, we have seen some of the pamphlets were circulated amongst some of the reservation lobbies in Maharashtra by Maoists. So are they trying to now, and then the pamphlets have been suggesting some of the castes there to take up to arms to solve their issues. So the point is that this is really a challenging and really complex set of circumstance where they're trying to make use of some of the caste discriminations, and rather than looking at it from a human development point of view, they are looking at it completely from a political point of view and trying to really play one caste against other. So whether the justice and negotiation, whether they are going to solve the problem, or there has to be some sort of a robust political response, grassroots democracy. Closing remarks, please. Prafulji, Dr. Bahiraji, and Alokji.
See, I would like to make one important distinction here, the ideological transformation that has taken place from Marxism to Maoism and now cultural Marxism. See, please try and understand, it is not just about caste. It is about using all kinds of fault lines in the society, whether it is on the basis of race, it's as Black Lives Matter campaign we have seen. It was not by the essentially by the, it was by the left organizations, ultra left organizations in the US. I'm not saying the issues are not genuine, but it can be gender, it can be caste, it can be, in case of South India, it will be region and the the so-called Dravidian identity. It can be any issue. It is basically the new kind of technique to use subcultural identities to target any umbrella identity. It's a typical, a cultural revolutionist paradigm, or rather, the see, if you see the origin of cultural studies, it says the purpose of cultural studies is not to study the culture, but to create a new one. What is that new one is never defined. But challenging the hegemonic culture is common to them. So they will define what is hegemonic, and then they will create certain peripheral identities to pick up arms against this so-called hegemon. In case of India, it can be Indian state, it can be Brahminical order, it can be patriarchal order, it can be Hindutva paradigm. They will name it differently for different groups. But the target will be the same, the Indian state and Indian democracy. So please try and understand that this is a totally different kind of modus operandi and ideological paradigm. And we have to, as Alokji rightly said, we have to understand the ideology. It is not just a security perspective that is going to help. It is a completely a distant, or rather in present day I would call it mutant ideological movement. It has mutated from classical Marxism to Maoism to cultural Marxism. So unless you understand this mutant variety of Maoism, you will not be able to deal with it.
Thank you, Prafulji. Thank you for those remarks. Dr. Beheraji, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, this, taking from Prafulji. So what you see is that the formation of the class bringing different classes together, which are necessarily kind of guided by an anti-state sentiment. So the common enemy factor actually works here. Okay, so how do you delegitimize it? So one thing is that when there is a security kind of an approach needed to fight them militarily at the ground, there is also an intellectual approach needed to actually delegitimize the so-called intellectuals who actually give justification to all sorts of kind of violence. One needs to I've been doing it, in my book you will see the next book that is coming, More Than Maoism. You'll see that how all of these pundits who have never visited Vastar talk about Vastar. Okay, so we have examples of the NDTV journalist who actually visited Odisha just for 24 hours and came out and wrote a book. Okay, I have my 20 years of experience in writing on Maoism, starting from Nepal till India. I have not been able to write a authored book. I have written an edited one, but I do not have the courage or the expertise so far. I feel a little nervous. But that needs to be actually called. People do not go. One thing Prafulji was mentioning, that why the media do not have the access. I would say that the so-called media sitting in the urban centers, they are ignorant. Okay, they are ignorant, and this ignorance cocktailed with a kind of anti-state mindset is a dangerous kind of combination. Okay, that is where they give a culture out of kind of an image, out of imagination most of the time. Coming to the ground, how do you do it? Bring in a small changes. This has been written to the government time and again, that every government office at the local level need to have a local person. Recruit your local boys and the girls. They will be able to communicate to the people. Okay, once they start communicating about the government things, you will see the support base of the Maoist will drastically come down. Okay, that has actually taken place. And one more last thing I'll say, let's give a lot of credit to the local people. Okay, yes, we have security wise, we have brought them, we have got them to the sides, but at the same time, my study says, I have been traveling extensively in these areas. The local people have started rejecting the idea of violence. Okay, let's give it to them. Okay, they are the ones who are not subscribing the so-called revolutionary violence anymore. Okay, the Pathalgatti movement, okay, doesn't have the kind of support for the Maoist. The Niyamgiri thing, when the Maoist came, the people like Jagannath Maji, Lada Sikaka, they said you have no business here, and I have witnessed it in my own naked eyes. They have no business here. You please go back. This is our movement. Whatever that's in a democratic way, they didn't pick up arms. Okay, they of course they fought against some development project, but they didn't take up arms. Okay, with such kind of people, you can always negotiate, you can always talk. Okay, so that is where, okay, let's communicate to the local people one-to-one. You don't need this, civil society organization. You don't need mediatories. Okay, you need the local boys and girls coming to their village, going to their village and talking to their people. You will see this problem because, your first line of defense, your own people, not any security forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for their remarks, and we purely took up this particular issue because we want peace and prosperity in that particular region, and peace is one of the fundamental building blocks for any social development or economic development. And because of that, we wanted to have this academic conversation where we explore the various facets of it. As you might have imagined, the topic is very broad, and we'll continue to explore that from an academic perspective and continue to explore various facets of the topic. And Dr. Bahiraji, I assure you that when your book will come out, we would like to hear more about your book and take a deep dive into that. We had a lot of audience from Europe as well as US also patiently listening to our conversation and also contributing through their questions. And some of them we have covered, many of them we couldn't cover, but this is first a lecture in this particular series. We'll continue with that. With that, I would like to thank all our speakers and panelists. I would like to thank Alokji, Prafulji, Dr. Beheraji, and I would like to say that now the session is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Prafulji. All of you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Anshuman Bharaji. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Subhamsi. Okay.